I'm Faz Shakir.
I'm Amanda Litman, and this is Battleground. I am still flying solo this week because Faz is spending time with his very cute new baby. My guest this week was Brian Fallon, the co-founder and executive director of Demand Justice. Brian Fallon, welcome to Battleground.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Give me the TLDR. What does Demand Justice do, for those who aren't familiar with it?
So we are a group that is trying to get progressive activists to understand that the courts are an important arena for us to try to influence politically. And it is not an issue that is on the tip of the tongue of most progressive activists or even most progressive voters. And as a result, we've been getting our butts kicked for the last 30 years on this issue. And we are trying to sort of shake up how Democrats approach the courts. During the years that Trump was in office, we organized a lot of volunteers and spent a lot of money on ads and trying to stop some of Donald Trump's worst nominees. But as much as we focus on trying to contest what Republicans are doing in terms of the people that they put on the courts, we're also trying to create a bit of a shakeup in the Democratic Party in terms of how we approach judges in the courts. It's mostly taking our cues from progressive legal elites that have been telling progressive activists that that the courts are an issue that has to remain apolitical and that should not be the subject of democratic activism. I think that's all wrong. I think conservatives have been organizing around the courts for a long time. They've been committing activist energy to this issue. They've been making it an issue that they wage campaigns around and that their candidates speak to during the course of their candidacies. I think our side needs to develop those muscles too. And so we're trying to challenge old school institutionalist, normsy democratic thinking as much as we're trying to contest what Republicans and Mitch McConnell are doing. And we're having some success. And the Biden administration, thankfully, in the person of Ron Klain, who's their chief of staff, sees things in a very different way than previous Democratic administrations. And so we're seeing new types of people being nominated by President Biden to the courts. And so that's encouraging, but in a different respect in terms of, we believe that there's some big picture structural changes needed to undo the damage that Republicans have done to the courts. We're still encountering a lot of institutionalist minded thinking, even from the Biden administration. So we're trying to work from the ground up of building awareness among Democratic activists and recruiting volunteers and convincing Democratic lawmakers that this is an issue that they need to be prepared to think boldly about.
You talk about going up against institutions and establishment Democrats. Up until 3 to 4 years ago, you would have probably characterized yourself as one of those. You worked for Schumer, you worked for the DOJ. Was there a moment that was radicalizing for you?
Well, I think in the aftermath of 2016, there were a lot of people in our party that started to see the world differently and started to think that the old way of approaching politics was just not going to meet the moment. And I think that the party is slowly but surely adjusting itself to that new reality. And you see it playing out in across issues beyond just the one that I'm directly involved in, which is judges in the courts. But I think if you asked myself or a lot of Democrats 5 or 7 years ago about the idea of growing the number of states, and we should get rid of the filibuster in the Senate, and we should seriously reconsider the Electoral College, that these were all ideas that people might have thought were a little pie in the sky 5 to 7 years ago. And slowly but surely, but especially in the last couple of years, we've come to see these as not just, pie in the sky ideas. These are absolutely critical reforms that are needed to restore democracy in this country. And so I think that what the types of things that we're calling for doing with respect to judges and the courts, I think fits right alongside those other ideas that might have 4 or 5 years ago seemed like something that was wishful thinking and never not politically viable, but that Democrats have come to realize is something that we need to convince our party to embrace, and that we will never sort of fulfill our hopes for the country as a true multiracial democracy unless we get some of these ideas mainstreamed and enacted.
Can you describe a little bit the Republican infrastructure around courts?
It's a great question, a great way of putting it. All of this infrastructure that was created is the result of decades of planning and investment by well-funded, deep-pocketed interests that aligned around basically two issues: corporate interests and issues concerning religious issues, the evangelical movement. And those two sort of issues and those two sets of donors that are motivated by those issues have really propelled this movement such that an organization like the Federalist Society is funded probably 10 or 20 to 1 compared to its left-wing analog, the American Constitution Society.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know that you encounter these funding disparities all the time when you're trying to convince Democratic donors to consider giving to down ballot races and investing in long-term infrastructure versus giving to the trendy Senate candidate of any given election cycle. A lot of reporters and even staffers on Capitol Hill would come to me during the Kavanaugh fight and during Ruth Bader Ginsburg's the subsequent battle over her seat, and they would say, "Hey, even if this doesn't go your way, you're probably raising all kinds of money off of this, right?" And I was like, "No, you know why? Because Chuck Schumer doesn't tell big Democratic donors in New York and California to give to groups like mine that are trying to plan for the long term.
Nope.
They say, like, hey, if you're upset about this, give to our Senate candidate so we can flip the Senate." And that's almost as far as any of these donors think in terms of the next federal election cycle.
I do think it's worth noting, though, the two issues that you pointed out of corporate interest and evangelical, which tends to embody itself most often in abortion and women's right to choose. Do you think there's something specific about that draws out sort of the conservative, both I think conservative donors, but also conservative voters that we don't have on our side in terms of the way our voters think about the courts?
Yeah, it's sort of an unholy marriage that exists on the right. It's obviously business interests and corporate America's goals that are fueling a large part of the cash infusion and the engagement from elites on the Republican
Mm-hmm.
side. But that's not a huge, oh, we need to overturn Chevron deference so
Yeah,
that
voters
the
don't give a
EPA
shit. Yeah.
can't regulate greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah.
That's not really a thing that galvanizes rank and file voters on the Republican side. They tend to whip their voters up into a frenzy by talking about abortion and reaching evangelical audiences that way. And the other issue that we haven't talked about is guns and
Mm-hmm.
and the fear that the next Democratic president is going to take your guns away, and a Supreme Court that consisted of a majority of Democratic appointees would overturn Heller and end the individual right to bear arms. And so guns and abortion are the two rallying cries that truly mobilize the conservative grassroots. But what is funding that network and that infrastructure? What's funding Americans for Prosperity and all the in-state organizing that the Koch brothers do? It's corporate America business-backed dollars fused with organic enthusiasm amongst conservative rank and file voters around the issue of guns and abortion.
Let's talk about abortion because it does seem like Roe v. Wade is on the chopping block. And part of that has been the intended goal of the Republican broader ecosystems investment in state legislatures to pass the, overreaching bills that then get in front of the Supreme Court. Is there anything we can do to save abortion access in America? Are we super screwed?
Well, I think that there is something that we can do. And to me, the question is just whether we will truly summon the will to do what it's going to take. You're already hearing calls from some corners that the solution here is to codify Roe v. Wade and give it the force of federal law and try to head the Supreme Court off at the pass that way. And of course, I would totally support that effort. It's going to take, I think, getting rid of the filibuster to do it. And we all know where that stands right now.
Yeah.
But make no mistake, if we were to pass a law like that, it would end up right back in front of these same justices. And so to me, it's a short-term solution at best. Mm-hmm. And this is true across issues. I say the same thing in the context of the John Lewis Voting Rights Restoration Act. Should we pass it? Absolutely. Should we content ourselves that just passing that would be sufficient? Absolutely not, because the Supreme Court will gut the next Voting Rights Act just like they gutted the original one in 1965. So on any of these issues, whether it's gun safety or abortion rights or voting rights, you need to have a legislative solution that directly addresses the issue at hand, but you need a sidecar strategy for dealing with the court. And so to me, having a strategy for reforming the court is as necessary as getting rid of the filibuster to address any of these issues. Just like you need to be able to get through the Senate, and you're going to need to get rid of the filibuster to pass something like codifying Roe or to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, you're also going to need a Supreme Court reform strategy so that after going through all that trouble, winning the trifecta, winning those Georgia seats, somehow getting Sinema and Manchin to go along with getting rid of the filibuster to pass these. We're going to come back in 3 years and have the Supreme Court undo them all. That's the fate that we're in store for unless we have a court strategy alongside these other ideas.
Thanks for watching. You can get the full episode of Battleground on The Recount streaming daily or listen to it wherever you get your podcasts.